This is the story of the most expensive facelifts in automotive history, and the disasters that forced car companies to fix their mistakes. From billion-dollar redesigns to rushed emergency updates, some of these cars were so bad they had to be fixed before they even had a chance to fail. Strap in, because what you're about to see will change how you look at car updates forever. Mercedes-Benz W212, the most expensive facelift in history. When Mercedes launched the W212 E-Class, the company proudly claimed it had created a modern sedan with a touch of classic styling. The problem was that customers didn't really want classic styling. They were leaning more toward futuristic BMWs and Audis. So, Mercedes decided to invest 1 billion euros into updating the model. Yes, what usually costs manufacturers a few hundred million, Mercedes did at 10 times the price. The result was the most expensive facelift in history. The company completely redesigned the front end, ditching the dual headlights, revamped the rear, improved the suspension, and introduced a semi-autonomous driving system, something no competitor had at the time. And while the facelift itself was impressive, the question remained: was it really worth spending €1 billion on a mid-cycle update? Fiat Punto, the car with an identity crisis. Fiat decided that one name for a car wasn't enough, so the Punto changed its name 3 times during a single model cycle. First, it was the Grande Punto, sounded bold and confident. But then, in 2009, the company thought it needed a fresh image, so the car became Punto Evo, even though it had nothing in common with the Mitsubishi Evolution. If you think that was the end of it, no. Fiat went even further. In 2012, they changed the name back to just Punto, as if nothing had ever happened. It's like changing your name 3 times in 7 years and pretending you've always been the same person. Subaru Impreza, the car with 4 faces. In the 2000s, Subaru decided that one facelift wasn't enough, so they updated the second-generation Impreza 3 times over 7 years. Bug-Eye, 2000. Huge round headlights that immediately sparked criticism. Subaru quickly realized their mistake and brought in the designer of the McLaren F1 to fix it. Blob-Eye, 2002. Smoother lines and a less polarizing look, making it the most balanced version of the generation. Hawkeye, 2005. Sharper headlights and a more aggressive stance, finally giving the car the rally-inspired identity people expected. Stink-Eye, 2007. A minor facelift with an angry-looking front end, marking the final chapter before the next-gen model arrived. 4 different faces, 1 car. Subaru was essentially experimenting in real time, making Impreza one of the most frequently redesigned models of the decade. Peugeot 407, the car that wanted to be a fish. When Peugeot introduced the 407 in 2004, the first thing everyone noticed was its enormous front grille. It wasn't just big, it was gigantic, looking more like the mouth of a bottom-feeding fish than a car's air intake. Some called it bold, others called it ugly, but Peugeot didn't care. They were convinced this was the future of design. Underneath the controversial styling, the 407 had advanced suspension, borrowed from the Citroën C5, making it one of the best handling cars in its class. But there was a problem. While the suspension worked well in France's smooth roads, on rougher surfaces, it felt like the car was made of glass-sensitive, fragile, and expensive to fix. Despite this, Peugeot stuck with the fish-mouth design philosophy for years. And while it didn't win any beauty contests, the 407 still became a common sight across Europe, proof that good engineering can sometimes overshadow weird styling. Volkswagen Passat B5, the Audi in disguise. When Volkswagen released the Passat B5, they wanted it to feel premium. But instead of just making a nicer interior, they went all in. The car was built on the same platform as the Audi A4, had longitudinally mounted engines, and even shared parts with Audi models. It was basically a budget A4, or at least, that's what people thought. The problem? Audi wasn't happy about it. The Passat was too good. It had nearly the same driving experience as an A4, but at a lower price. So, Volkswagen made sure the Passat always had slightly worse suspension, slightly worse materials, and slightly less refined engines. It was designed to be inferior on purpose. Even so, the Passat B5 became one of the most beloved models in Volkswagen history. It looked classy, felt premium, and had an engine lineup that ranged from tiny diesels to the monstrous 4.0 LW8, a completely unnecessary but wonderful creation. Renault Laguna 2, the most unreliable car in France. Renault had big plans for the Laguna 2. It was supposed to be the first mass-market car with a keyless entry system, a futuristic interior, and class-leading safety features. But instead, it became famous for something else, being one of the most unreliable cars ever made. Owners quickly realized that the electronic keycards often stopped working, leaving them stranded. The fancy electronics? Prone to failure. The early diesel engines? Disaster zones. Laguna 2 had so many issues that even Renault admitted it had gone overboard with innovation. By the time Renault fixed most of the problems, the car's reputation was completely ruined. And that's a shame, because under all the reliability nightmares, the Laguna 2 was actually a great handling, comfortable, and stylish car. It just needed less ambition and more common sense. Ford Mondeo Mach 3. The car that should have been a BMW. When Ford launched the Mondeo Mach 3 in 2000, they weren't just making another family sedan. No, Ford wanted to prove a point, that they could build a car as good as the BMW 3 Series, but sell it for half the price. And in many ways, they succeeded. The Mondeo Mach 3 had sharp handling, a surprisingly refined ride, and an interior that didn't feel cheap. It was so good that journalists started calling it the working man's BMW. Even taxi drivers loved it. This car could survive 300,000 kilometers of abuse without breaking a sweat. But there was a problem. No matter how good the Mondeo was, it was still a Ford. And to many buyers, a Ford badge could never compete with BMW, Audi, or Mercedes. The Mondeo became one of the most underappreciated cars of its time. Brilliant to drive, practical and reliable, yet always living in the shadow of the German brands. Opel Vectra C. The car that put you to sleep. Opel had a plan. The Vectra C was going to be bigger, more comfortable, and more high-tech than ever before. But in their quest for refinement, they accidentally made one of the most boring cars on the planet. The design? Plain. The handling? Soft and forgettable. The driving experience? Like sitting in a dentist's waiting room. Even the powerful 3.2 LV6 version felt lifeless. The only real excitement came from the Vectra OPC, a 280 horsepower monster that Opel created almost as an apology for how boring the regular versions were. Still, the Vectra C wasn't a bad car. It was comfortable, solid, and practical. It just lacked any kind of personality. People didn't love it, they didn't hate it, they just didn't care. Mazda 6GG. The underdog that never gave up. In the early 2000s, Mazda wasn't doing great. Sales were down, their lineup was uninspiring, and people didn't take them seriously. So when they launched the Mazda 6GG, they needed it to be a game changer. And somehow, against all odds, it was. The 6 wasn't just good, it was fun. It handled better than any of its competitors, had sharp styling, and felt like a car designed by people who actually loved driving. Sure, the early models had rust issues, Mazda's eternal curse. But the car was so enjoyable that owners didn't care. Over time, the Mazda 6 built a reputation for being the enthusiast's choice in a world of boring sedans. It never sold as well as the Passat or Mondeo, but the people who bought one knew the truth. This was the best-kept secret in the midsize car world. BMW E39, the last great 5 Series. The BMW E39 wasn't just a car, it was a statement. Built between 1995 and 2003, it was the last true driver's 5 Series before BMW went all in on electronics and comfort over raw driving feel. With its perfect weight distribution, legendary inline-6 engines, and a chassis that made you feel like a king on the road, the E39 was the benchmark for executive sedans. Even today, a well-maintained one can make a modern car feel dull, but there was a price. If you didn't treat it right, it would punish you. Cooling system failures, expensive suspension repairs, and electrical gremlins were all waiting for owners who thought they could neglect their E39. Yet, despite the headaches, it remains one of the greatest sedans ever built. Owning one today? That's a flex only true car lovers understand. Mercedes-Benz W210. The rusty tank. The W210 E-Class had everything: luxury, comfort, and a reputation for being built like a tank. If you drove one, people assumed you were either a businessman or a gangster. It had big, soft seats, engines that could pull a house, and that classic Mercedes over-engineering. But there was one tiny issue. It rusted like an old shipwreck. You could see a W210 looking mint one day, and 6 months later, it had holes in the fenders. Mercedes tried to fix it, but the damage was done. The W210 became known as the luxury sedan that dissolved before your eyes. Yet, despite the rust, people still love it. Find one that survived, and you'll understand why old-school Mercedes sedans are still considered some of the best cars ever made. Volvo S60P2, the Swedish sleeper. Volvo spent years making boxy, safe cars. But with the S60P2, they decided to add some spice. The result? A sleek-looking sedan that combined Volvo's legendary safety with a touch of performance and attitude. The T5 version? A turbocharged beast with 250 horsepower that could embarrass a lot of so-called sporty cars. The R version? Even crazier, 300 horsepower, AWD, and adjustable suspension. And best of all, nobody expected it. It looked like just another Volvo until you floored it. Reliability? Solid, as long as you maintained it. The biggest issue was the AWD system, which could be expensive to fix. But for those who wanted a fast, safe, and underrated sedan, the S60P2 was the perfect sleeper.